ago saying, you know, our community members, local governments in Southeast Minnesota have questions about what these impacts are. And I'm so excited that we have team members, Brigitte and Carrie, who are also here.
Bill's here.
And Bill,
here.
where's and Bill? So who are also here because they are the ones who motivated this project to say we have questions about what are the energy and water impacts. And so that's what we seek to do is to collectively answer some of those questions over the course of this year. We're a big team, so we have localities in Southeast Minnesota as well as folks at the University of Minnesota. We are lucky to have funding from the Institute on the Environment at the university to help us do this. So as was said in the beginning, I'm Elise Harrington. I'm at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, which is our public policy school at the University of Minnesota. And so happy to be joined here by Anna and Amy, who are graduate research assistants at Humphrey School as well. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the project, what we're working towards, our timeline, a little bit what to expect, and then we're going to talk some about some early kind of discussion points from the case studies that we've been working on in this project. So what are we working towards? Our project is really grounded in thinking about what are the tools that local governments in Southeast Minnesota need, really driven by our partners on the project who are in Byron, Stewartville, and Lewiston. And we've kind of thought of these in 4 different buckets. One is thinking about a toolkit that's laying out the different pathways for data center development. So as Benya kind of talked about in the beginning, our project too is not necessarily trying to advocate for one perfect path towards data center development, but say like, hey, here's these different options that we have learned about over the course of our project, and here's a way that you have a toolkit to understand those options regarding decisions on resource use for data centers. We have a set of policy briefs that we're generating, thinking about what is that Minnesota policy landscape that is particularly salient, and what do we know about the impacts of data centers on energy and water resources that is particularly relevant for local governments. We've thought a lot about what does this mean regionally within Southeast Minnesota to talk about collaboration on this issue. And finally, engagement resources. We have a series of workshops, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. The opportunities for folks in this room beyond to engage with this project. And we will also have the resources that we come out with available to folks to use. So we have 3 components to this project. The first is what we'll be talking mostly about here today, which is learning from other places. There are many parts of the country that have a longer history of dealing with data centers, thinking about their impacts, experiencing those impacts. Well, let's take a moment to learn from those places. So we're looking at case studies in other parts of the country, both doing interviews as well as collecting other materials. Then we're going to go into a phase of kind of tailoring this information to Southeast Minnesota, thinking about what are the kinds of scenarios of data center development that are particularly important to thinking about here, and do a whole set of kind of data collection and information tailored towards here. How do we make sure we understand what's going on? And then let's have broader communication and engagement, doing workshops beyond, really thinking about engaging city administrators in these conversations, as well as broader community members. So today, I'm talking to you really kind of still situated in this learning from others phase, and we're starting to move towards this tailoring to Southeast Minnesota part. And it's here in the kind of third part of our project that we hope many of you in this room might join us in our research activities. So we're going to go in and talk a little bit about what we have learned so far from some of these case studies. And I framed it as kind of the opportunity that we've had that we're learning from both leaders in this as well as neighboring places. Maybe not always the places that you hear about with data center development, but they might have similar situations to Minnesota in terms of resources. And so that has grounded us thus far in our case studies looking at Virginia, in particular Northern Virginia. So that's the part of the country that gets lots of attention on data center development. And as well as we've done interviews and case studies focused on Iowa. Our initial learning points to kind of 3 buckets that we want to talk through with you today. The first is perhaps mentioned a little bit in the Mentimeter poll, thinking about proactive zoning, what places learn from where data centers have been cited. And infrastructure investments as opportunities for innovation, what places have shared about site infrastructure and energy and water investments, and incentives and benefits, what places have shared about attracting and benefiting from data centers. And most of this is really focused on how do we think about the tools and information that local governments might need, and how do they put together that picture of the resource demands on the one hand and the benefits that they might receive to their community on the other. And so as we kick off proactive zoning, I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Thanks, Louise. Hi, I'm Anna. I'm going to talk a little bit about siting and proactive zoning and location of data centers. So zoning is sort of being used as a common tool for local jurisdictions to embed regulations regarding data centers, with stringency often varying based on a local community's attitude towards having data centers in their communities. So many counties provided us with insightful advice about what they wish they would have known about data centers before them entering their communities. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that from a planning and zoning perspective. These three general themes that we heard were industrial zoning, buffer zones, and overlay zones, as well as some takeaways about by right zoning, and then some takeaways about noise and aesthetics. So I'm going to run through those now. The first is industrial buffer and overlay zones. Several planning departments provided information on zoning types and sort of the principles that they wish they would have known when considering data center growth. Industrial zones is something that came up quite a bit. So planning for data centers in these zones allows for them to be sited in areas of a similar use type, ideally further from residential and community important areas. A lot of people also brought up buffer zones, so providing sort of a maximum buffer between data centers and residential areas. In a lot of the interviews in Virginia, particularly, we heard that people wish they would have sort of created proactive zoning so that data centers were further away from residences. And then also overlay zones. So planning for where you would like the data centers to be located prior to being approached by a developer is something that we heard a lot. So sort of envisioning what you would like to see and where you would like to see data centers and where you would not like to see them was sort of an important thing that we learned in some of our interviews. Next theme that we sort of identified was a shift from by right zoning to conditional use. So some jurisdictions are moving away from data center zoning by right, which allowed for development to occur too close to residential areas, and allowed data centers to be developed in areas where the community wasn't necessarily envisioning data center development. So there's been a move toward sort of conditional use or special exemption zoning, especially in some of the areas in Virginia, like Loudoun County, which has massive data center development. They've sort of moved to conditional use, which allows for increased public participation and public comment opportunities, and allows for more sort of regulatory approval, like going through the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisor approval. And then finally, on this point, we spoke with a lot of folks who were sort of seeing aesthetic and noise parameters as sort of an increasingly concerning point for citizens. So some counties are adding aesthetic and noise parameters into their zoning ordinances. So one example is Prince William County, Virginia, which includes sort of facade, design, buffer, and fencing specifications for data centers. And then Fairfax County, Virginia, which requires noise reduction and visual screening. So we're sort of seeing that be implemented into county and local zoning ordinances more frequently in places where they have a lot of data center development. And then there's also some considerations for technologies to mitigate noise and aesthetic impacts. Backup generators are a significant source of noise when they're being used, which could be replaced with other technologies, which is being talked about in the data center space, such as battery storage. But then there's also some counties that are requiring more stringent sort of parameters around what types of generators are being used. So Loudoun County is requiring tier 4 generators, which are known to be quieter and less polluting. So there's sort of some mitigation opportunities within the noise and aesthetic area as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Amy, I'm one of the GRAs. I'm gonna go over some of the needs that we're seeing, these data centers come up with that are kind of causing controversy. So they kind of need water, energy, access to fiber, lots of land, because they're large facilities, and road access, mostly for construction needs, but also some access afterwards. And these are kind of the main topics we see brought up by a lot of the municipalities that we are talking to. The sites require infrastructure upgrades most of the time. This infrastructure build-out can be a source of contention between municipalities and the developers. If they're a large enough municipality with enough of resources, they actually will use bonds to pay for this infrastructure upgrade. We see them creating special TIF districts to help pay down that bond debt afterwards. This is not necessarily applicable to smaller municipalities, so they have to be a little bit more creative in how they go about this. The infrastructure includes things like water access, energy, roads, and sometimes fiber if it's not already accessible. And there is some controversy around the water treatment capacity for some of the smaller towns as well. They do have water that is connected to municipal waterways, so you will have to deal with treating some of that water. And a couple of municipalities have to work getting close to their capacity of water treatment. So they have to consider an upgrade of the facility, and how that goes about getting paid for is something they have to negotiate. The immediate infrastructure around the site is easier to get a data developer to give some money or participate in upgrading. Anything else outside of that, such as that water treatment facility, is a little harder. And we talked a little bit about on-site backup generation. It is required. They want uninterrupted power, whether it's going to be power outages or something else. They mostly use diesel or natural gas generators. Some talk about battery backups, but we have not interviewed anybody who's using that within a data center yet. Permitting a backup generation varies a lot between states and even local municipalities, depending on certain regulations. This produces most of the noise outside of just like the generic hum when they're testing them or using them, as we talked about a little earlier. And there are some options to reuse a few things to reduce resource demands. Not a lot of it is actually being applied right now, but it's something to consider for the future. Wastewater, the centers actually don't need potable water for cooling, so they could use wastewater from other industry, but it has to be close enough to that industry to make it feasible. And they're often not building multiple centers within one spot. They kind of pair them up and then disperse them just for redundancy's sake. So it's harder to kind of locate them by other large water users in general. And then waste heat is something that has been considered, again, not in practice here in the United States, but is something that could be considered if they are located close enough to some sort of area that would be using it for heating, whether that be like a building facility for offices, or if it's close enough to residential to actually be worth spending money on that infrastructure. And then closed loop cooling is actually more common now. Most newer data centers are using this technology because they also do not want to pay for a lot of water. So they're using this as a way to reduce their water use. And once they actually fill up the system, they pull very little water from the system. So they're not paying as much in water fees and using as much water capacity as they have in the past.
Okay, I will just close us out with the last kind of theme, thinking about kind of the incentives and agreements. And we really asked about these questions to think about what are the multiple dimensions that municipalities and counties are thinking about as they're trying to balance these resource questions. And so this figure is from Loudoun County, Virginia. That's the kind of area in Northern Virginia that's considered data center alley. It's a very high concentration of data centers. And so you can see from this kind of a substantial growth in tax revenue from data centers. So the county reports that they have kind of 39% of their tax revenue is from data centers on just 3% of their land. So it is a very high value kind of industry for them. And what you can also see is the difference in this figure between what they have as real property versus computer equipment or personal property. And that personal property revenue is about 65 to 70%. And that is I think really grounding this conversation for them about the kind of benefits that they have locally from data center development. Jurisdictions describe that this kind of revenue is able to cushion them from other kinds of impacts to their tax base, other changes on things like commercial property or needs to increase residential taxes. But there was a pretty big message that we heard across interviewees, which is don't give away too much. That localities are in the driver's seat because there is demand for data centers. And so be really careful about these kind of agreements that you make such that you are able to have a discussion about a positive kind of tax revenue situation. So the kinds of incentives, what do they look like? The most common things we heard of were tax exemptions and abatements, the kinds of infrastructure investments that Amy talked about, that they're the ones responsible for that. That's what they're bringing to the table. And some cases of a franchise fee rebate, so franchise fees that actually go through the electric utility, then being rebated back to a developer. The other kind of range of benefits that you will hear in return, and I'll just go through this quickly because I know you're going to hear much more about this later, were things like community betterment payments. Some of those were specified in development agreements. So X number of dollars per building over a certain period of time. Others were much more ad hoc. Here's kind of the agreement we're making for a particular fund. There are investments in community needs or amenities. Housing was mentioned. One-time or emergency support funds. So in Northern Virginia, there's been a lot of changes in their kind of employment in the last few years. And so making sure that there's been some emergency support funds and education and training programs, in particular those where the local community colleges or trade schools have come together with the data center developers to offer new data center programs like data center operations. This was grounded by a message we heard of defining what is important to your community to be able to include what kinds of benefits should go into these kinds of agreements. So the issues that we continue to think about, as I said, we're kind of still in our early phases of this project. And we're still thinking a lot about what are the key areas of local government action versus what might need to happen at the state level. So one question that came up, for example, for us in interviews was, well, if we need more information on something like water or energy, should a municipality be asking for that, or should that go to the state level? So there's some things that we're still thinking about like how do we disentangle what is right for what we're learning from these case studies that guides local government action versus higher levels. And how do we do things like link community concerns, like Anna talked about noise and aesthetics, with ways to think about mitigating energy and water resources. So that could be things about how we're thinking about those being connected to backup generators or connected to the ways that you might reuse heat. Does it have kind of benefits in lots of these different ways? And so those are some of the questions that are driving us as we go forward. And I just thought I would remind everyone that where we are headed, we have a few gaps that we would like to fill in our case studies as we continue to go on. There's been lots of discussion about excitement for thinking about energy innovation, and actually not a lot of examples from our case studies so far. So that's one that we would really like to fill that gap in. And make sure that we're continually thinking about places that are comparable in their dynamics to Minnesota. And then next, we're going to be thinking about how we identify development scenarios specific to Southeast Minnesota, do activities like water modeling, interviews with regional stakeholders. We're going to start to narrow in. And then later in the spring, have our kind of workshops, and we're excited for hopefully many of you to join us for those. So I'll just put another little QR code plug up here that if you would like to stay informed on this project, you can go to this QR code, and we have a little survey that you can fill out. It gives you an opportunity to learn more about our events, join a list that we're pulling together for making sure you are all informed about what our next steps are. We're really excited to share this with you today and know that this is, our first step in what we hope is a kind of way to really help support the region with this research.